Now, after a fairly lacklustre 2023, venture capital investment is growing again in Europe. Figures published today by the data provider Dealroom suggest European startups raised $13.7 billion in the first 3 months of the year. That was up 5% on the same period last year. For the fourth consecutive quarter, energy tech is the most funded startup sector in Europe, while the UK remained the most popular investment destination. It attracted more investment than the next two most popular destinations, Germany and France, put together. Well, joining me now to talk about this is Sahar Meghani. She's partner at the Visionaries Club. Sahar, welcome to you.
Thanks for having me.
Is this the sort of recovery that you would have been looking for at the start of the year?
Absolutely. This is great news for European tech ecosystem. I think we feel that the ecosystem is very much alive and well. We think investment levels have really stabilized post a sharp drop, back to 2021 levels. And it's fantastic news because we're seeing good news across different fronts. So as you mentioned, investment is up 5% year over year. We saw 500 companies raise 2 million or more for their startups, and that's in the early stages. If you go later down the line, startups that are raising 100 million or more in the later stages, that was up 2x year over year, which again shows the resilience of our European tech ecosystem. Geographically, too, we saw a lot of diversity in terms of where these startups are based. And so the UK, as you mentioned, led in funding. We saw funding coming from Germany, from France, and the Netherlands actually broke records thanks to a few mega rounds that were announced there. I think this is very much in sharp contrast to the US, where we see innovation really concentrated in very few cities and hubs. And I think from an industry perspective, too, you mentioned energy really was the leading force for the uptick this quarter. But we saw funding in fintech, in enterprise software, in health, and of course, generative AI also had a decent amount of investment this quarter.
Yeah, although generative AI, I think, only attracted $399 million. There were lots of other sectors that attracted more. Why is that?
Yes, I think you have to look at these numbers kind of quarter over quarter. So I think if we think about the rest of 2024, and when we look at our pipeline, there's a lot coming in generative AI. The companies in Europe that are building generative AI solutions, I think they're focused more on the tooling and the solutions that build on top of the infrastructure. The infrastructure is really the more capital-intensive part of where the VC funding goes. So a lot of the founders that are building in Europe are building tools, say, for doctors to help free them of the administrative burden of all the paperwork and having to write up their notes rather than spending time with the patient themselves. We recently invested in a business called Causally, which helps research scientists really accelerate their work to help sift through a lot of publications to accelerate drug discovery. That's the kind of work that the generative AI startups in Europe are really focused on. They take less money than some of the infrastructure plays that are happening in the US, but we expect a lot of funding going to it this year.
Okay. I mean, do you think Europe can ever close the gap on the US in this regard, then?
I think I'm very optimistic. We've seen some big rounds happening in Paris, for example, with there's a company called Mistral, which is going toe-to-toe with OpenAI. I personally feel that we have the talent, we have the capital, and very much the ambition level to build some really game-changing businesses. It's still very early when it comes to generative AI. And I think from the investor community, there's a lot of optimism in terms of what can be built in Europe.
Now, in the meantime, energy tech continues to attract the most money in terms of individual sectors. What sort of activities is that going into?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's been a really big momentum in Europe to decarbonize and to electrify Europe. A lot of the funding that we've seen this quarter very much is going towards those that kind of really important work. So we're expecting 30 million electric cars to be on the roads in Europe by 2030. If you think about the infrastructure that needs to be put into place for that, so all the charging networks, the software that needs to support those charging networks, the fintech and the payment infrastructure that needs to be in place, this is very expensive work. And actually, we're really excited to see energy and climate tech really get the funding that it deserves in order to get Europe kind of leading in these fields.
And briefly, you mentioned there have been some big rounds already this year. Would you expect that to continue over the rest of the year? What's 2024 looking like?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at our pipeline, there's some really interesting businesses kind of across stages that we're seeing. So we're seeing very young Startups, of course, these will not move the needle as much in terms of the gross number of funding, but we're also seeing later stage companies. We think there's a really strong pipeline of what we call, unicorn companies of $1 billion of valuation or more. I think what I would love to see at the end of 2024, maybe 25, is see the IPO window opening up a bit. And so hopefully some of that pipeline of companies can reach their next milestone, and we can see some real giant success stories in Europe.
We all live in hope of that. Sahar, good to see you today.
Thank you for having me.
Still to come here.